The cemetery sits far from the roads people still use. There are no convenience stores nearby, no houses with porch lights glowing in the distance, no traffic sounds drifting in to remind you that the rest of the world is still awake. Once you pass through the gates, the noise of modern life falls away almost immediately. What remains is space. The cemetery is old, older than most of the town that now exists miles away. Some of the headstones lean at angles that suggest the ground beneath them has shifted over decades. Others are worn smooth enough that names have faded into unreadable shapes, as if time itself decided certain identities were no longer necessary. After midnight, the place changes. The air feels heavier, carrying the scent of damp earth that rises from the soil and settles low to the ground. It clings to your clothes, your hands, the back of your throat. Each breath feels slower, more deliberate, as though the night expects you to move carefully. Wind moves through the trees that surround the cemetery, but it doesn't rush. It travels in long, measured passes, causing branches to rub together overhead. The sound isn't loud, it's steady, repetitive, the kind of sound that becomes noticeable only when everything else has gone quiet. Moonlight reflects unevenly across the headstones. Some catch it fully, pale and bright against the darkness. Others remain swallowed by shadow, their shapes only half formed until you're standing close enough to recognize what they are. That uneven light makes it difficult to judge distance. Paths appear shorter than they are. Corners seem closer, then farther away again as you move. I didn't come here looking for anything out of the ordinary. The reason was simple. I had a camera with me and nowhere else was quiet enough to use it. The cemetery had been open during the day before, and no signs suggested it closed at night. It seemed like a place people had simply stopped thinking about. At first, it felt empty. No voices, no footsteps, no movement beyond the slow drift of fog near the ground. The pathways between graves stretched out ahead of me, pale gravel bordered by grass that hadn't been cut in months. Each step sounded louder than it should have, the crunch echoing briefly before being swallowed by the surrounding silence. What struck me most was how sound behaved. Every small noise carried farther than expected, the click of a camera strap, the shift of my weight. Even breathing felt too loud, as if the space itself was listening for it. After midnight, the cemetery doesn't sleep, it waits. The fog thickened as the minutes passed, sliding between headstones and pooling in shallow dips in the ground. From a distance, it made the earth look uneven, as though the ground itself were moving. I stopped more than once just to listen, not because I heard something, but because I expected to. That's the effect places like this have. The longer you stand still, the more aware you become of what should be happening. Crickets, distant animals, wind is changing direction. But none of that came. The quiet was complete, and it wasn't comforting. Standing there, surrounded by markers of lives long finished, I realized something I hadn't considered before entering. The stillness didn't feel abandoned. It felt maintained, as though the absence of sound wasn't accidental, but the result of something holding it in place. I remember thinking how strange it was that the most unsettling part of the cemetery wasn't the graves at all. It was the open space between them, the paths where nothing was marked, the areas without names, the sections where the ground looked untouched. That's where my attention kept returning. So, let me ask you something. Would you ever enter a cemetery alone at night? Not for a challenge, not to prove anything, just because it seemed quiet enough. Because once you're there, and the world beyond the gates fades away, you start to understand how easy it is to feel unseen, and how difficult it becomes to know whether that feeling is true.
I noticed it only after I stopped moving. Up until that point, my attention had been focused on the path in front of me, the sound of gravel beneath my feet, the slow rise of fog around my ankles, the familiar comfort of motion, even in a place that felt increasingly quiet. It was when I paused to adjust my camera that something shifted at the edge of my awareness. Not close, not sudden. Far off, beyond the path, near the line where the cemetery gave way to trees. At first, I assumed it was an animal. That explanation came easily. Cemeteries sit on large stretches of undisturbed land. Wildlife passes through them all the time, especially after dark. A deer, a stray dog, something small is moving low through the grass. I told myself that was all it was. Still, I stood there longer than necessary, listening. The wind moved through the trees again, causing branches to sway and shadows to stretch across the ground. Headstones seemed to shift as the light changed, their shapes elongating, then collapsing back into themselves. Then I heard footsteps, not on gravel. That detail mattered. The sound came from beyond the path, from a section of ground where no one walked. It was soft, irregular, the sound of weight pressing down into soil, then lifting again. I turned my flashlight toward the tree line. The beam cut through the darkness in a narrow arc, catching fog as it drifted slowly across the ground. For a moment, I saw nothing, just uneven earth, tall grass, the suggestion of space between trunks. Then the light reached farther. Something moved. It wasn't fast enough to be startled motion. It wasn't low enough to be an animal. The shape rose just slightly, then settled back, as if whoever or whatever was there had adjusted their stance. I lowered the flashlight. The moment I did, the sound stopped. That was when the sense of being watched began. Not as fear, not as panic, as awareness. The feeling didn't come from the direction of the graves. I remember that clearly. The headstones behind me felt inert, fixed, bound to the ground they marked. Whatever had drawn my attention had drifted away from them, in the open space. I scanned the area again, more carefully this time. The flashlight moved more slowly, tracing the tree line, the gaps between trunks, the dark pockets where fog gathered thickest. Nothing approached, nothing retreated. The shape stayed where it was. That's what unsettled me most. If it had been another visitor, they would have moved once the light hit them. If it had been an animal, it would have fled. Even curiosity usually draws something closer, at least for a moment. This did neither. It remained distant. I took a step backward. The sound returned. One step, then another, always offset from my movement, delayed by just enough time to notice. I stopped. It stopped. I didn't feel chased. I felt measured. The flashlight trembled slightly in my hand as I held it steady, keeping the beam trained on the same section of ground. The fog shifted, briefly thinning, then thickening again. For a fraction of a second, the light caught something vertical. Not a tree, not a marker. Too narrow, too still. I adjusted the angle. Nothing. My pulse had quickened, though I hadn't realized it yet. Each breath sounded louder than the last, filling the space between the trees before fading away. I became aware of how exposed the paths were, how clearly they cut through the cemetery, how anyone standing just beyond them could see without being seen. That's when I understood something I hadn't considered before. The figure wasn't near any grave. It wasn't positioned among the markers or standing over a plot.
It kept to the edges, the places without names, the areas where nothing was meant to draw attention. It stayed where it could watch the paths. I shifted my weight again, slowly this time, testing the silence. The sound followed. Still distant, still controlled. Never closer, never farther away. The longer I stood there, the clearer it became that whatever was out there had no intention of crossing the open space between us. It didn't step into the light. It didn't retreat into the trees. It waited. And in that waiting, there was intent. I lowered the flashlight once more and turned my body slightly, just enough to change my line of sight. That's when the sensation deepened. Not fear, recognition. The awareness that something had registered me as part of the environment. Not an intrusion, not a threat, just something moving through a space it already understands. I didn't stay there much longer. I told myself I had seen enough, that there was nothing to be gained by standing still any longer. I convinced myself that once I returned to the path and continued walking, the presence would fade back into the night. But as I took my first step away, the sound followed again. Not closer, just present. And for the first time since entering the cemetery,